The emergency klaxons of the Galactic War Council station had been wailing for 3 straight hours, which was honestly pretty typical for a Tuesday. The massive hexagonal chamber buzzed with the nervous energy of a dozen alien species who had just realized that humanity once again had done something completely inexplicable during wartime. Admiral Zenthara of the Centaurian fleet adjusted her 6 arms nervously as she reviewed the emergency Zhao-Ji protocols on her datapad. "I still don't understand why we need an emergency session," she muttered to her aide, a small purple blob that communicated through interpretive jiggling. "The humans agreed to the 72-hour ceasefire with the Scarans. Everything should be proceeding according to standard diplomatic protocols." The aide jiggled skeptically. "Yes, I know it's humans we're talking about," Zenthara sighed. "But even they can't possibly mess up a simple ceasefire. What's the worst that could happen in 72 hours? Across the chamber, the massive view screen flickered to life, displaying the stern face of Council Chairman Blixnote, whose species had evolved from what could best be described as a disappointed turtle. "Council members, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. It concerns the Human Admiral Jake Morrison, designation Bulldog, and his conduct during the current ceasefire with the Scaran Empire." A collective groan echoed through the chamber. Admiral Morrison was humanity's most decorated and most feared military commander, known throughout the galaxy for his tactical brilliance and his alarming tendency to solve diplomatic problems by shooting them. He had single-handedly ended the Crystal Wars by challenging the entire Crystal Armada to arm wrestling contests. He'd resolved the Methane Rebellion by somehow convincing the rebels that their cause was totally lame. The man was a walking diplomatic incident waiting to happen. "Oh no," whispered Commander Vextall, the Etherian representative whose feathers were already starting to molt from stress. "What did he do now? Please tell me he didn't challenge the Scaran Warchief to single combat again. The insurance claims from last time are still being processed." Chairman Blixnoth's expression grew even more disappointed, which was scientifically impressive given his species' natural state of perpetual disappointment. "The situation is far more complex than mere combat challenges. We have received surveillance footage from the neutral zone that shows Admiral Morrison engaging in what can only be described as highly irregular behavior." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of General Cromp, the crystalline representative slowly rotating his geometric form in what passed for anxious fidgeting among his people. His internal light patterns flickered in increasingly rapid sequences that roughly translated to, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," in 17 different dialects. "Before we proceed," Chairman Blixnoth continued, "I must warn you that what you are about to see may fundamentally challenge your understanding of human military doctrine. Our xenopsychology experts have been reviewing the footage for 6 hours and have concluded that either Admiral Morrison has suffered a complete psychological breakdown, or humans are even stranger than we previously thought." Ambassador Fluffy McFlufferson, whose unfortunate name had been the result of a tragic translation error that his species was too polite to correct, raised one of his tentacles. "Mr. Chairman, surely you're being overly dramatic. Admiral Morrison may be unconventional, but he's never actually violated the terms of a ceasefire before. His methods may be unorthodox, but they're generally effective." "Ambassador McFlufferson," the chairman replied with the tone of someone about to deliver very bad news, "I'm afraid unorthodox doesn't begin to cover what we're dealing with. Display the footage." The main screen shifted from the chairman's face to a grainy surveillance feed from the neutral zone. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 18 hours into the ceasefire. The camera was focused on what appeared to be a makeshift camp near a damaged Scaran outpost, and there, clear as day, sat the most feared human admiral in the galaxy. And he was bottle-feeding what appeared to be a small, fuzzy creature with too many teeth. The silence in the chamber was so complete that you could hear Ambassador McFlufferson's dignity quietly leaving through the ventilation system. For exactly 47 seconds, the Galactic War Council stared at their screens in the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for witnessing supernovas or discovering that the cafeteria had run out of coffee. On the main display, Admiral Jake Bulldog Morrison, the man who had once ended a siege by intimidating an entire fleet into surrendering through creative use of profanity, was gently adjusting a tiny blanket around what was unmistakably a baby Scaran. The fuzzy little creature in his arms couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, with soft gray fur, oversized ears, and the kind of enormous eyes that evolution had specifically designed to make other species go "aww" involuntarily. It was making small chirping sounds as it enthusiastically attacked a bottle that looked suspiciously like it had been improvised from human military rations packaging. Commander Vextall was the first to break. The avian alien's feathers puffed out to approximately 3 times their normal size, and he began making a sound that could best be described as a tea kettle having an existential crisis. That's a Scaran cub, he squawked, his translator struggling to keep up with his increasingly hysterical pitch. A baby Scaran. He's feeding the enemy. This is either the most brilliant psychological warfare I've ever witnessed, or Admiral Morrison has completely lost his mind. General Cromp's crystalline structure began flickering, through colors that didn't have names in most languages, settling on a shade that roughly translated to confused orange with undertones of impending doom. His voice, when it finally emerged, sounded like a computer trying to divide by 0. Error. Error. Does not compute. Human military doctrine does not include provisions for infant care during active hostilities, requesting immediate system reboot. Nobody reboot anything, snapped Admiral Zentara, all 6 of her arms gesticulating wildly. We need to figure out what's happening here before we start shutting down cognitive functions. On screen, Admiral Morrison appeared to be completely oblivious to the fact that he was being watched by the entire galactic command structure. He was, in fact, making soft cooing sounds at the small creature, which had finished its bottle and was now attempting to climb up his heavily decorated uniform jacket. A second cub, slightly larger and more adventurous, had emerged from what looked like a makeshift nest made from military blankets, and was attempting to attack Morrison's bootlaces with the ferocity of a creature 1/10 its necessary size. Ambassador Fluffy McFlufferson, whose dignity had been found hiding behind a potted plant and coaxed back into the chamber, cleared his throat with a sound like a deflating balloon. Perhaps, he said carefully, there's a reasonable explanation for this. Maybe the Admiral is interrogating them, using advanced human psychological techniques we don't understand? Chairman Blixnote's expression somehow managed to become even more disappointed. Ambassador, unless human interrogation techniques now include peekaboo games and what appears to be singing lullabies, I don't think that's what we're looking at. Indeed, the audio feed had just kicked in, and Admiral Morrison's gravelly voice could be clearly heard singing what sounded like an old Earth nursery rhyme, though the words had been somewhat modified. Hush, little Scaran, don't you cry. Daddy's gonna sing you a lullaby. And if that lullaby don't work, Daddy's gonna teach you to go berserk. The third cub, apparently drawn by the singing, had waddled over from somewhere off Kammon and was now attempting to climb Morrison's leg like a furry, determined mountain climber. The Admiral paused his singing to gently detach the small creature and lift it to eye level. Now listen here, you little tactical nightmare, Morrison said to the cub with the same tone he'd once used to address enemy generals. We've discussed this. No climbing the uniform during feeding time. That's a court-martial offense. The cub responded by licking his nose with a tiny purple tongue. General Cromp made a sound like a hard drive crashing. This does not align with any known human behavioral patterns. Humans are supposed to be ruthless, efficient killing machines. They don't. His voice trailed off as Morrison began making airplane noises while spoon-feeding what appeared to be mashed military rations to the most eager cub. Daily don't what, General? Asked Admiral Zentara, though she was pretty sure she didn't want to know the answer. Please don't adopt enemy offspring during active military campaigns. Cromp's lights were now flashing in patterns that could only be described as frantic disco panic. This breaks approximately 17 different articles of the Galactic War Conventions, and possibly several laws of physics. Chairman Blixnot decided that the situation had progressed beyond mere observation into the realm of, we need answers before someone declares war on the entire concept of logic. He activated the communication link to the neutral zone, and Admiral Morrison's wrist communicator chirped with an incoming priority transmission. Morrison looked up from where he was attempting to burp the smallest cub, which had apparently eaten too enthusiastically and was now making distressed squeaking sounds. Yeah, what is it? Kind of busy here with a tactical situation. Admiral Morrison, the chairman's voice crackled through the small speaker. This is Chairman Blixnoth of the Galactic War Council. We're currently observing your activities in the neutral zone, and we require an immediate explanation for your conduct during the ceasefire. Morrison glanced around until he spotted the surveillance drone hovering nearby, gave it a casual salute with his free hand, and continued patting the cub's back. Oh, hey there, Council. Didn't see you watching. Don't mind me, just dealing with some refugees here. Nothing that affects the ceasefire terms. Admiral, Commander Vextal's voice squawked through the communicator, his feathers still at maximum fluff. Those are enemy combatants you're harboring. Morrison held up the tiny Scaran cub, which couldn't have weighed more than 2 pounds soaking wet, and was currently trying to eat its own foot. This little guy? Commander, I've seen more threatening behavior from my grandmother's knitting circle. And my grandmother once knitted a sweater so ugly, it was classified as a psychological weapon. But they're Scarens, protested General Crump, his voice taking on the electronic equivalent of hysteria. The most feared warrior species in 3 sectors. They're genetically programmed for violence and destruction. Yeah, well, Morrison said, successfully extracting a tiny burp from his charge and looking quite pleased with himself. Apparently, they're also genetically programmed to be adorable when they're hungry and scared. Who knew? He settled the cub back into the makeshift nest where its siblings were already curled up in a fuzzy pile that looked like it had been designed by evolution specifically to break hearts. Admiral Zenthara leaned closer to her communicator. Admiral, how exactly did you come to be in possession of these cubs? Morrison's expression grew more serious, though he kept his voice gentle as one of the cubs had started to doze off. Found them yesterday morning when we were sweeping the abandoned Scaran outpost for intel. Their nursery had taken a direct hit from our bombardment 3 days ago. He paused, looking down at the small creatures. Place was a mess. No adult Scarans anywhere. Just these 3 little guys, cold, hungry, and scared out of their tiny minds. The communication channel fell silent except for the soft sounds of sleeping alien babies. I tried calling it in through proper channels, Morrison continued. But you know how military bureaucracy works. By the time we'd have gotten approval for a rescue operation, filed the appropriate forms in triplicate, and waited for the Xenobiology Corps to show up, these little guys would have been history. Ambassador McFlufferson's tentacles writhed with confusion. But Admiral, surely protocol would dictate that you simply leave them? They're technically enemy casualties. Morrison's voice took on a tone that could have frozen plasma. Ambassador, I don't know what kind of protocols your people follow, but humans don't abandon helpless babies to die alone in the dark. Doesn't matter whose babies they are. That's not war, that's just being a monster. But the logistics alone, General Crump protested weakly, his lights flickering in patterns that suggested his logical processes were running into serious computational errors. How did you even know what to feed them? Scaran physiology is completely different from human. You improvise, Morrison interrupted, gently adjusting a blanket around the sleeping cubs. Turns out baby formula is pretty universal. Warm milk, some nutrients, lot of patience. I may have had to threaten the ship's quartermaster into giving up our entire emergency milk supply, but that's what tactical requisitions are for. Commander Vextal made a sound like a strangled parrot. You used military resources to acquire baby formula? Damn right I did. What was I supposed to do, let them starve while I filled out a request for non-standard nutritional supplies form? These little guys were crying their hearts out, and they looked at me with those big eyes like I was the only thing standing between them and the void. Morrison's voice softened as he watched the cubs sleep. Besides, they'd already imprinted on me by the time I figured out what was happening. Try explaining abandonment issues to a baby Scaran sometime. The communication channel buzzed with the electronic equivalent of several species having simultaneous nervous breakdowns. General Crump's crystalline form was now cycling through colors that existed primarily in the ultraviolet spectrum, which his translator helpfully rendered as panic in B-flat minor. Imprinted? Squeaked Commander Vextal, his feathers standing so straight up he looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Admiral, do you have any idea what you've done? Scaran cubs imprint on the first dominant figure they encounter after hatching. You're now their recognized pack leader. This is a psychological bond that lasts for their entire lifespan. Morrison shrugged, which was quite an achievement given that 2 of the cubs had crawled onto his shoulders and were now using his collar insignia as teething toys. Yeah, figured that out when they started following me around like fuzzy little heat-seeking missiles. Kid psychology is pretty universal, turns out. Admiral Zenthara's 6 arms were now moving in patterns that her species used to ward off evil spirits. This isn't psychology, Admiral, this is biological warfare. You've weaponized cuteness. This has to be some kind of advanced human strategy we don't understand. Lady, the only strategy here is keeping 3 babies fed, clean, and not crying at 3 in the morning. Which, by the way, is surprisingly similar to managing a military battalion, except with more burp cloths and fewer explosions. Ambassador McFlufferson tentatively raised a tentacle. Perhaps we could put this in perspective by comparing it to our own species' child-rearing practices. On Fluvia Prime, our young are immediately placed in communal learning pods where they're raised by certified educational specialists according to strict developmental protocols. That sounds horrible, Morrison interrupted bluntly. These little guys need individual attention, not some assembly line approach to parenting. One of the cubs had woken up and was now attempting to groom Morrison's beard, apparently convinced it was part of the pack hierarchy grooming ritual. General Crump's lights flickered desperately. But the inefficiency, the resource allocation, my people reproduce by crystalline budding, which requires no emotional investment whatsoever. The offspring simply absorb necessary knowledge through harmonic resonance patterns. It's perfectly logical and cost-effective, and probably why your people have the emotional range of a calculator, Morrison replied, gently detaching the cub from his facial hair. Look, I get that you all handle things differently, but humans? We're hardwired to take care of small, helpless creatures. It's not a strategy, it's just who we are. You see something this tiny and vulnerable, and your brain immediately goes into protection mode. Chairman Blixnoth, who had been ominously silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Admiral Morrison, are you telling this council that you have unilaterally initiated first contact protocols with enemy offspring based on what you describe as hardwired responses? I'm telling you that I found 3 scared babies and did what any decent person would do. The fact that they're technically classified as enemy combatants is a bureaucratic problem, not a moral one. Commander Vextel made a sound like a deflating balloon. But the precedent this sets. What happens when other human commanders encounter enemy young? Will they all abandon their missions to start impromptu daycare centers? Morrison considered this seriously while demonstrating the proper technique for supporting a cub's head during feeding. Probably, yeah. Humans are funny that way. We'll fight tooth and nail against adult enemies, but show us their kids in trouble and we'll move mountains to help them. It's like a species-wide design flaw, except we call it having a conscience. The largest cub had apparently decided that Morrison's explanation was boring and had begun attempting to climb inside his jacket pocket, chittering softly in what sounded remarkably like baby talk. Morrison absently helped the small creature settle into the warm pocket, where it curled up with a contented sigh. "This is insane," whispered Admiral Zenthera, all 6 arms now covering her face. "You've turned a military operation into a nursery." "The military operation is still running fine," Morrison protested. "My troops are maintaining all ceasefire protocols, our positions are secure, and intelligence gathering is proceeding on schedule. The only difference is that I'm now doing it while making sure 3 babies don't die of neglect. I'm calling it multitasking." General Kromp's voice had taken on the electronic equivalent of a whimper. "But what happens when the ceasefire ends? You can't take them into battle. It violates every principle of military engagement." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful as he watched the cubs, 2 of whom were now fast asleep, while the third practiced what appeared to be tiny predator pounces on a spare bootlace. "You know, that's actually a really good point. We're going to need to figure something out before this ceasefire expires." As if summoned by the very mention of complicated diplomatic situations, the long-range sensors began blaring with an incoming transmission. Morrison glanced at his tactical display, then at the 3 cubs, who had all woken up at the sound of the alarm, and were now making distressed, chirping noises. "Well, this is about to get interesting," Morrison muttered, gently scooping up the smallest cub who had started crying. "Looks like we've got incoming Scaran vessels. Big ones." The main view screen in the War Council chamber split to show both Morrison's feed and the tactical display of 3 massive Scaran dreadnoughts dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the neutral zone. Chairman Blixnoth's expression managed to achieve new levels of disappointed turtle as he recognized the lead vessel. "That's the flagship of War Chief Graxthor himself," the chairman announced, with the tone of someone watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. This ceasefire negotiation just became significantly more complicated. On Morrison's feed, the cubs had apparently recognized something about the approaching ships, because they'd all started making excited chittering sounds and attempting to climb toward the communication array. Morrison was trying to keep them corralled while simultaneously preparing for what was about to be the most awkward first contact scenario in galactic history. "Attention, human vassals," a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a cement mixer boomed across all frequencies. "This is War Chief Graxthor of the Scaran Empire. We have detected the presence of our missing young in your custody. Explain this violation of ceasefire terms immediately." The War Council chamber erupted in panicked alien chatter, but Morrison just sighed and activated his communicator. "War Chief Graxthor, this is Admiral Morrison. Before we get into the whole violation of ceasefire discussion, I need to know something. Are you missing 3 cubs, roughly 6 weeks old? Last seen in the nursery section of Outpost Teth 47? There was a long pause. When Graxthor's voice returned, it had lost some of its commanding boom and gained what could only be described as parental worry. You have found them? They are alive?" "They're alive, healthy, and currently trying to eat my communication equipment," Morrison replied. gently detaching the largest cub from a blinking control panel. Found them 3 days ago after the bombardment. Nursery took a direct hit, no adult supervision anywhere, and they were in pretty rough shape. Another pause, this one filled with what sounded like muffled Scaran voices in rapid conversation. When Graxthor spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of relief and confusion. You preserved the lives of our young during active hostilities? Well, yeah. They're babies. What was I supposed to do, leave them to die? The communication channel buzzed with the electronic equivalent of an entire war council trying to process this information. Commander Vextal's feathers had now achieved what could only be described as maximum poof, while General Cromp had stopped cycling through colors entirely and was just displaying a steady pattern that translated roughly to system overload, please restart universe. This is unexpected, Graxthor admitted. In our culture, enemy young are considered acceptable casualties of war. We did not expect humans to preserve them. Morrison's voice took on the same dangerous edge it had used when addressing the council earlier. Well, Chief, that's where humans and Scarans differ. We don't consider babies to be acceptable casualties of anything. These little guys needed help, so they got help. Simple as that. What happened next would go down in galactic history as either the most heartwarming moment of interspecies cooperation or the most ridiculous diplomatic incident ever recorded, depending on who was telling the story. The largest cub, apparently recognizing its father's voice coming through the communicator, began making increasingly excited chittering sounds and trying to climb toward the speaker. Morrison, interpreting this correctly, held the small creature up to the communication device. The sound that emerged from War Chief Graxthor's flagship could best be described as what happens when a freight train tries to express paternal affection. It was a deep, rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through the hull of every ship in the area. The cub responded with its own tiny version of the sound, and suddenly all 3 babies were chittering and purring at maximum volume, trying to crowd around the communicator to talk to their father. They remember me. Graxthor's voice carried a note of wonder that was completely at odds with his fearsome reputation. How is this possible? They should have forgotten pack bonds after this much separation. Turns out your kids are pretty resilient, Morrison said, now juggling 3 excited cubs who all wanted to be closest to Daddy's voice. Though I should probably mention that they've gotten kind of attached to me, too. Fair warning, they might not want to leave immediately. As if to demonstrate this point, the smallest cub began making distressed sounds when Morrison tried to set it down, clinging to his uniform with tiny claws and burying its face in his shoulder. This is complicated, Graxthor admitted. Traditional Scaran protocol would be to challenge you to combat for custody of the young, but you preserved their lives when you could have allowed them to perish. This creates a debt of honor that conflicts with standard territorial imperatives. Ambassador McFlufferson tentatively raised a tentacle. Perhaps we could arrange some sort of joint custody agreement? The silence that followed this suggestion was so profound that several species began checking their translation equipment to make sure it was still functioning properly. Joint custody? Graxthor repeated slowly, as if testing out a concept that didn't exist in his language. It's a human thing, Morrison explained, while absently bouncing the smallest cub who had started fussing. When parents can't agree on who gets the kids, sometimes they share. Kids spend time with both parents, everyone stays happy. This is not possible, Graxthor protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Scaran young must be raised according to warrior traditions. They cannot be influenced by... He struggled to find the words. By someone who makes sure they eat their vegetables and get enough sleep, Morrison suggested helpfully. The cubs, meanwhile, had apparently decided that this conversation was taking too long and had begun a coordinated assault on Morrison's pockets, searching for hidden snacks with the determination of tiny, furry tactical units. What followed would later be studied in diplomatic academies across 17 sectors as either the most brilliant negotiation in galactic history or the most accidental peace treaty ever accidentally negotiated by someone who was primarily focused on preventing 3 baby aliens from eating his uniform buttons. Look, Morrison said, gently extracting a cub from his breast pocket while it clutched a stolen energy bar. Why don't you come down here and we'll figure this out face to face? Your kids want to see their dad, and I could use some help with feeding time. 3 babies are a lot of work for one person, even if that person has commanded entire fleets. War Chief Graxthor's response was a long pause, filled with what sounded like heated discussion in the background. When he finally replied, his voice carried the tone of someone making a decision that would either be remembered as visionary or get him court-martialed by his own people. Very well, Human Morrison. I will transport down to discuss terms. But I warn you, if this is some elaborate trap. Chief, the only trap here is 3 babies who figured out how to work together to open food containers. Trust me, if I wanted to trap you, I'd use something a lot more sophisticated than infant Scarans with abandonment issues. 20 minutes later, War Chief Graxthor materialized on the surface of the neutral zone in a shimmer of transport energy, and the Galactic War Council got their first look at what 8 feet of heavily armed, battle-scarred Scaran warrior looked like when confronted with the sight of his children being cared for by the enemy. Graxthor was exactly what Central Casting would have ordered for intimidating alien warlord. Massive, covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating, with claws that could open standard military-grade containers and teeth that suggested his species had evolved from something that considered other sentient beings to be a food group. His battle gear was scarred from countless conflicts, and his reputation as one of the most feared military commanders in known space was well earned. He took one look at Admiral Morrison, who was currently sitting cross-legged on the ground with 3 tiny Scarans crawling all over him like he was a jungle gym, and stopped dead in his tracks. "This is," Graxthor began, then trailed off as the largest cub spotted him and let out an excited chirp that roughly translated to, "Daddy!" in 17 different languages. The reunion that followed would have made a documentary filmmaker weep with joy. The cubs abandoned Morrison immediately, tumbling over each other in their excitement to reach their father. Graxthor, this 8-foot-tall engine of destruction, dropped to his knees and gathered his children in his arms, with a gentleness that seemed to violate several laws of physics. The sounds emerging from the war chief could best be described as what would happen if a freight train learned to purr. The cubs responded with their own tiny versions of the sound, and for several minutes, the neutral zone was filled with the kind of family reunion that usually required soft focus cameras and orchestral background music. Morrison watched with the satisfied expression of someone who had just successfully completed a very complicated mission. "They missed you," he said simply. Graxthor looked up from his children, and for the first time in his military career, the feared war chief appeared to be struggling with emotions that didn't involve conquest or tactical superiority. You cared for them, fed them, kept them safe. Why?" "Because they needed it," Morrison replied, as if this explained everything. "And because that's what decent people do when they find scared kids who need help." The largest cub had apparently decided that this emotional moment needed more participants, and began chittering at Morrison until he moved closer. Then, in a move that would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades, the small creature positioned itself so that it was touching both Morrison and its biological father, essentially declaring that both adults were part of its pack structure. "This is unprecedented," Graxthor said quietly, watching his child interact with the Human Admiral. "In our culture, pack bonds are exclusive. A cub cannot have 2 primary caregivers from different species." "Well," Morrison said, gently scratching behind the cub's ears, "maybe it's time your culture learned something new. These little guys seem to think it's working fine." Chairman Blixnoth's voice crackled through the communication system, carrying the tone of someone who had given up trying to understand what was happening and was now just along for the ride. "Gentlemen, while this is all very touching, we still need to resolve the technical aspects of this situation. The ceasefire expires in 36 hours and we need to establish formal protocols." Morrison and Graxthor looked at each other, then at the 3 cubs who were now playing some sort of game that involved climbing between their 2 adoptive parents, like they were living playground equipment. "You know what?" Morrison said. "I've got a proposal. How about instead of ending this ceasefire, we extend it indefinitely? Call it the Scaran-Human Cooperation Accord, joint custody of the kids, shared parenting responsibilities, and maybe we figure out how to be neighbors instead of enemies." Graxthor considered this while absently preventing one of his children from eating Morrison's rank insignia. "This would require approval from the Scaran High Command. They do not traditionally approve of cooperation with former enemies." "Tell them it's a tactical alliance," Morrison suggested. "Joint training exercises, cultural exchange programs, and if anyone gives you trouble, remind them that humans are apparently really good at finding and taking care of lost Scaran children. Which means we'd probably be pretty good allies to have." The smallest cub chose that moment to fall asleep curled up between Morrison and Graxthor, apparently deciding that this arrangement was perfect and any adults who disagreed with it were clearly not thinking clearly. 6 months later, the Scaran-Human Cooperation Accord had become the most successful peace treaty in galactic history. The 3 cubs, now significantly larger and bilingual in both human standard and Scaran battle language, had become unofficial ambassadors between the two species. They spent weekdays learning traditional Scar and warrior skills from their biological father, and weekends learning human technical theory from their adoptive father, who had somehow managed to incorporate advanced nap time strategy into the military curriculum. The Galactic War Council had established the Morrison-Graxthor Protocol, which officially recognized joint interspecies custody arrangements and had led to a 17% decrease in active conflicts galaxy-wide. Apparently, it was much harder to maintain territorial disputes with people who might be helping raise your children. Admiral Morrison had been promoted to Ambassador Admiral, a position that had been created specifically for him, and basically involved solving diplomatic crises by finding their emotional core and addressing it with practical solutions and an alarming amount of common sense. War Chief Graxthor had been appointed as the first Scaran Cultural Exchange Coordinator, a job that mostly involved explaining to other Scaran commanders why their new human allies insisted on sending care packages and birthday cards to their children. And the three cubs, now known throughout the galaxy as the first interspecies pack, had grown up to become exactly what you'd expect from children raised by two different military traditions. Highly disciplined, tactically brilliant, and completely convinced that any problem could be solved through proper application of strategy, overwhelming force, and making sure everyone got enough snacks and sleep. The universe, it turned out, was a much more peaceful place when people remembered that even the most fearsome enemies were usually just parents trying to take care of their kids. Commander Vextal's feathers had eventually returned to normal, though he still molted slightly whenever anyone mentioned the Morrison incident. General Cromp had undergone a complete personality upgrade and now specialized in what he called emotional logic processing. And Ambassador Fluffy McFlufferson had successfully petitioned to have his name changed, though he was still working on getting the paperwork processed through 17 different bureaucratic departments. But every year on the anniversary of the Great Ceasefire, the entire Galactic Council received a holiday card featuring 3 young Scarans in tiny military uniforms, signed from the Morrison-Graxthor family in 2 different languages and what appeared to be crayon. It was, everyone agreed, exactly as ridiculous and heartwarming as everything else involving humans turned out to be.